If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Deep woods hikers and campers, what is the strangest or scariest situation you have come across? My family used to go camping with a few groups of friends when I was a kid. I remember one Christmas when I was about 5, we were camping out in the bush. There were 9 kids in total at our campsite. We were allowed to wander through the bush. The parents would give us a walkie-talkie to tell us when to come back to camp. We never wandered far. Anyway, out of nowhere an unfamiliar voice came over our walkie-talkie. It was a man's voice. He said he was Santa and that he was trying to find us to give us our presents and asked us to look for him. We all ran back to our campsite all excited that Santa had talked us. The walkie-talkie was taken off us and we weren't allowed to go anywhere for the rest of the trip. We were pretty devastated at the time. But I understand the seriousness and creepiness of it now looking back as an adult. I live on a ranch in western Idaho, and every June we move cows from our property to a place on the other side of Hit Mountain, and because we don't have the trailers to drive our cattle, and because it's summer, we just trail them through BLM land and some private property. Last summer it was business as usual, bedrolls, teepees, and a few pack horses to haul that stuff. It's basically a long camping trip, a new place each night with the sound of cattle and days spent with too many hours in a saddle. First 2 days always suck, but you get used to it. Anyway, to the, interesting vet. Third night and I had second watch, to basically make sure that the cattle weren't getting too far from where we were camped. I'm about 2 hours in, 3 a.m. or so, when the cows nearest me boogered pretty bad and pushed the herd away from me. Obviously that's a bit of a problem, so I went to check it out, as you do. When I tell you that whatever the hell that thing in the sagebrush was, it wasn't natural. It was like a person, except the arms were too long and the eyes were too big and the skin was stretched in ways that were just wrong. Most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. I backed towards where we made camp, and thank God the thing didn't follow, but it was definitely watching me. I woke up my stepdad and mom, who came out with a rifle to investigate. The thing was gone when we got over there, but there were some really bizarre tracks around the sagebrush. And when we rounded the cows up the next morning 2 calves were missing, and there were more of the same bizarre tracks around our camp and where the horses were. Never found any traces of the calves, and I wouldn't take watch for the rest of the drive, for obvious reasons. I have nightmares about that still. Here's my story. Of the countless hours I've spent in the woods, it's the one time, the only few seconds, that I can't explain. I distance hike when I can. Sometimes this means getting up early, or staying out late, to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes, walking in the pitch dark with a low light headlamp gets spooky. I grew up in the woods of this area. I've slept under our canopy of stars more nights than I can count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trail, riverbank, lake shore, ridge, bottoms, bogs, and creeks. I've hunted the game. I'm establishing this because it's important you understand I've heard, seen, and smelt about all this region has to offer in the way of wilderness. My scariest experience though happened at about 0430 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for another 30 to 45 minutes, another hour past that until sunrise. I was on mile 5. I'm in a low bottom that's wedged between 2 steep ridges. The trail I'm on was narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in by thick underbrush, young maple, and old oak growth. I'm focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, zoned out. Then I heard a loud crack. And I froze solid. This is the part I have trouble describing. 0430 in springtime means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. Mid-step I froze. When fight or flight kicks in, you have these immediate instinct thoughts. The thought that instantly flashed in my mind as I stood there balancing myself into silence was, if I hear that again, I'm turning around, and I'm going back the way I came in a hurry. Why? Because that sound was not a branch breaking. It wasn't deadfall. It wasn't a widowmaker. I was damn sure I had just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice, well, that meant get out of here. To describe it as best I can, it sounded like a decent-sized wooden stick being violently whacked against a smallish tree. More a fungo bat-sized stick, than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head being that this sound was a crack, and not a thud or thump. And I have described it as explosive in the past because it was so sudden, and so terribly loud. I had the sense that it was about 50 yards directly in front of me, and it was loud and clear. Now, as I stood there, completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worst part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from. And I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards, I was going to come to a 180-degree turn and start up the ridge going away from the creek. This meant, as soon as I got the courage to move towards this noise, I was going to have to turn my back to it and get up that ridge. This made me very nervous. My head's somewhere between meth fiend murder and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes pass. I just breathe my foggy breath into my glasses and listen. Nothing. Dead quiet. I've got about 20 to 30 minutes until first light. I crank up the headlamp and start to slowly creep to the 180 turn. When you wear a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts a big black moving shadow on the trail. It didn't help. I get to the turn and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point. Trying to be quiet. Taking tiny, shallow breaths so I can listen while humping it up the trail. And then I smell it. A stench hits me that I can't describe. I just imagined wet, rotten, death. I've actually worked scenes where humans have expired in a past life as a firefighter. This was like days-old decomposition, but it just smelled strange. I kept walking fast. By the time I made the top of that ridge, I was huffing, and the first light was showing. I didn't stop moving until full light was out, and the birds were chirping. I've heard it all in our woods. I've smelled it all. I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall, and especially leafed-out branches, make a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times. I don't know. Me and a group of 20 others were hiking in a two-person side-to-side line through thick woods at around 1 a.m. We managed to find a muddy road which we continued to walk over for miles before going back into the woods. While walking on the muddy road, I held a conversation with one of my friends that was to the right of me. After a while of talking, I noticed that my group was further ahead of me than before, so I picked up the pace. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. The friend I was talking to was already with the rest of my group. I asked him how did he get back so quick, and he turned, looked at me and said, "I was wondering where you were, you disappeared for a good 5 minutes." Let's just say I didn't feel alright after hearing those words. I know for a fact I was speaking to him earlier, and if not him, then someone exactly the same with all the same gear. Luckily nothing happened after that, but I was pretty shook for the rest of the hiking night. This all happened in Poland when I was a teenager, part of what I call survivalist camp. I was camping alone on a beach a few years ago. At just after 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound, like something was gently brushing up against the tent. The waves were pretty loud, so I wasn't sure. As I started to fall back asleep, I heard it again. This time, I sat up. Suddenly, the sides of my tent were getting pushed in. I could see the shapes of hands pushing it in on all sides. No sounds came from outside other than the ocean. I was too terrified to even say a word. I've never been that scared in my life. After a few seconds that felt like an hour, it suddenly stopped. I waited for a few minutes, then unzipped the tent and poked my head out and flicked on a flashlight. There were shoe prints all around the tent. I figure it was probably just some kids messing with me. But damn, did they ever mess with me. Was somewhere in the middle of the White Mountains in the summer when I walked into what looked like a scene from a horror movie. A person with zero hiking, camping, or other experience had gotten themselves in trouble, big trouble. It was around 7 a.m. when I found the campsite. First thing that hit me was the eerie stillness, until I noticed the shredded tent under a tree and the desperate-looking human figure covered in blood, whimpering quietly. I put my bag down, grabbed my kit and went over to the person. They looked like they had just lost a knife fight with a four-armed man. Deep slashes from one shoulder to hip, single punctures up and down his back, and hands and forearms full of what looked to be defensive cuts. I patched him up the best I could, gave him water, checked my map and hightailed it to the closest road. This was before cell phones were super prevalent and barely worked in the mountains. Thankfully, the road was very close by, less than 2 miles, and I was able to flag someone down. They took off and I waited for assistance to arrive. It took about an hour until rescue arrived, and I led them to the still unidentified individual. He was not very conversive when I helped him out. I was sure he would be dead before we arrived, but was wrong. I assisted rescue bringing him out, and took them up on their offer to head into town and get cleaned up. After cleaning up and getting myself situated at their station, I went on my way, leaving them my number to call to let me know what was up with the person we helped out. I got home 3 days later, and there was a message on my machine. The story was that the guy I found decided to go camping one day and heard that he had to keep food hung from a tree to keep bears away. Well, he did that, but put it almost directly over his tent, and not high enough. The night before I happened upon the site, a bear had used the tent, and its occupant, in attempt to climb the tree to get to the food. The guy had woken up to 4 black bear paws sinking into his body, shifting to reach up. Dude survived, and swore to the hospital staff that he was moving to the city and never going into the woods again. This happened to some friends of mine in Sydney, Australia. When we wanted to go underage drinking, we would buy a case of beer or bottle of spirits and hike about 4 km into the bush to the middle of nowhere to drink without worrying about getting into trouble. Would sleep in a sleeping bag under the stars in summer and be fine. So one afternoon my friends, without me this time, headed off with beer to the usual camp spot we'd use. Being young and stupid, no one checked the weather forecast, otherwise they'd have known heavy rain was on the way. In the middle of the night, 5 drunk teenagers left the campsite to shelter in caves nearby. The caves sit high up overlooking a large fork in the Hawksbill River. Soaked from the rain and cold, they started to dig a fire pit. Unfortunately, they dug up human remains, were too drunk to return home, so spent a miserable night in the rain waiting for dawn. Didn't dare stay anywhere near the caves. This one still gives me chills. Me and my sister would take long trips into deep woods surrounding our secluded house. At a certain spot into the journey, a German shepherd without a collar would run out of nowhere and greet us. He was a full-grown dog and very friendly. He would follow us around for a bit and then continue on his way. Well, one day we went out like any other day, except our friend wasn't showing up. We didn't think too much of it until we found his body. It looked as though he was attacked by wolves with how ripped apart he was, but it doesn't look like the animal ate very much of my doggy friend at all, just sort of tore him up and left. Later we keep walking and talking about it, until we hear a very weird sound come from the distance. It sounded like what I can only describe as maybe a large animal moaning with a sense of maybe pain/confusion. It was far off at first, but when we heard it we stopped to listen. I couldn't hear leaves moving, but I heard it again. This time noticeable closer. The sound of a wailing animal, but it seemed more aggressive sounding this time. Then we hear it again, but it's directly on the other side of the hill we're at. Fucking bone-chilling wail, almost like a dying woman. Me and my sister bolted out of there without even thinking about each other. Just fucking sprint all the way back to a trail that would take us home. Sometimes I wish I stayed to see what it was, but nope, I'm good with the outcome of living. Walking a section of the Appalachian Trail with a couple of buddies when we happened across a bundle of sticks. The sticks were made into a figure, kinda similar to the ones from the Blair Witch Project. It was obviously placed there by someone, as it was dead center on the middle of the trail, leaning against a rock. I thought it was cool, so I grabbed it and put it in my backpack. Anyway, we finished the hike and set up for the night in our camping spot. We were all pretty wiped out from the long day, so after dinner we retired to our respective tents and conked out for the night. The next morning, I was the first one awake, so I got up to make the coffee, and what did I find? An identical bundle of sticks to the one we'd found, sitting atop the pile of charred wood from the previous night's fire. First thing I did was check my pack, and sure enough the one I'd picked up was still there. Each of my friends swore they didn't put it there, and I obviously said the same. It was weird because we were all adamant about not putting it there, but I can never be sure one of them wasn't fucking with the other two of us. The thing that messes with me is the bundle I found in the morning was almost an exact replica of the one we found on the trail earlier. And, I find it hard to believe one of the other guys could have made such a close replica without being able to model it after the one in my pack. And it's not like either would have placed the one on the trail beforehand for us to stumble upon, as it was far out in the middle of nowhere. I want to believe one of them pulled a prank on the other two because the alternative scares the shit out of me. I've told this story before, but it bears repeating. I live in Central California, in the valley, bordered on all sides by hills and mountain ranges. There are some great hikes and campgrounds all around, and my ex and I chose to go hiking in the Sespe Wilderness. It's about a 2-hour drive from home, and it's basically hiking in the mountains southwest of Bakersfield off a highway that leads to Ojai and the coast. Gorgeous country, very remote, no cell service. Both archaeology hobbyists, we decide to hike out past Piedras Blancas, a giant rock formation, and keep on that same trail paralleling the Sespe Creek in order to look for some Chumash pictographs. It's about a 5-mile hike, hilly terrain, full of scrub brush and smaller trees. The trail is well maintained and we are mostly alone out there. We reach an old campground about 3 to 4 miles out and I'm feeling tired, so I stop to rest at the campground. The campground is pretty much circular. There are several different campsites all in plain view of one another, and just to the east there's a large rock formation that overlooks the creek. The rock formation is kind of flat, so I go over and lay down on the warm rocks so I can listen to the water. He decides to continue further along the trail to see if he can locate the pictographs. I don't know how much time had passed when I hear the strangest howling scream I've ever heard. It went on for longer than a human should have been able to scream, and it alternated in from being very low and guttural to high-pitched like a woman. So I shoot up off the rock and start looking around, and I don't see anything. The sound didn't repeat and I started to think that maybe I was just hearing an animal. All of a sudden he comes crashing back down the trail at full speed, thinking that he is hearing me screaming. He describes hearing it a little differently. That sounds I heard were not the sound he heard, but we both agree we heard something very strange and can't explain it. We both kind of look around the camp, don't see anything out of the ordinary, and decide together that it's time to head back. So the sun is starting to set, it's late afternoon, and although it's still light out, it's that late afternoon golden hour kind of light. We are walking back and still on the trail that parallels the creek, and we start to hear boulders being thrown in the water. If you've ever been a kid by a body of water, you know what it feels like to pick up the heaviest rock you can and toss it into the water to hear the ker-plonk sound that heavy rocks make. This was heavier than that, and we knew it. We heard it several times, following us along the trail, and crashing sounds in the brush from across the creek. Whatever was throwing the rocks was following us, making sure we knew we weren't welcome. I have no idea what type of animal could throw very large boulders in the water like that. If it was a human, they did a damn fine job of pranking us, because we were terrified. We hurried as fast as we could. I ended up slipping on the trail and got a splinter in my arm that I wasn't able to dig out for months. We made it back to the parking lot near dark. I've only found one other online post about strange things happening in the Sespe Creek wilderness. I still don't know what we heard. 10 years ago, when I was a skinny little 17-year-old, I was hiking the rural side of a levee with a friend who was even scrawnier than I was. It was a long walk into the woods, and for about an hour or more we hadn't seen anyone else. Just trees and foliage. We finally stumbled upon a huge nest-looking area. It was so random and out of place, so we investigated. There was paper and cloth everywhere, torn magazine pages, old clothes, cans, everything piled into one huge mess. We assumed maybe people drove their truck out here and dumped their trash, so we just turned to leave, but in that very moment we saw a tall rugged man wearing all black staring right at us. He was maybe 6'3", had shaggy unkempt hair, and looked dirty and disturbed. He stood 15 feet away, and he was just staring and silent. My friend didn't say something, so I said, "Hi. Do you live here? Is this your stuff?" And he only nodded yes, and then we slowly backed away and left. He just stared at us until we could no longer see him anymore, and then we picked up speed to get back to civilization. I was hiking across Newfoundland, following an old railway that was long ago disassembled and turned into a giant trail, sleeping wherever I found myself at night. One day I ran into a small cottage town, except everything was abandoned. Trailers falling apart, bus conversions burnt out, small cabins all shuttered up. It was creepy but interesting at the same time. The sun was waning, so I decided to set up camp in a mostly empty lot that had an abandoned truck slowly falling into a ravine near it. Cooked up some food and crawled into my tent to sleep. I wake up sometime in the night and I hear footsteps outside my tent. At first I think it's an animal, but the steps sound like someone walking, a human. The steps get closer and go around my tent. I slowly and quietly pull out my knife. If he tries to get in, my plan is to stab first and ask questions later. Anyone trying to get into my tent at night in the middle of nowhere is looking to do some kind of harm. My heart is racing at this point, but I try to just be quiet. Luckily the steps start moving away from the tent until I can't hear them anymore. I wait a bit to see if they'll come back, but I don't hear anything. I slowly get out of my tent. I don't see anything. Without turning on my flashlight, I quickly take down everything and stuff it into my bag. After that I just started walking down the trail to get the hell out of there. I walked until daytime, came across a road and flagged down a truck. That guy was nice and drove me to town where I got a hotel. The creepy thing, when I think back to it, was that whoever that was likely watched me walk into town from one of the abandoned structures. I'm guessing a squatter. I'd like to think he was just curious, but I'm glad I didn't stay and wait to see if he'd be back. Solo backpacker here. Haven't had it happen yet, but I always worry about stumbling across a pot grow. I've found abandoned ones, never an active one, thankfully. One time I found a completely empty gallon milk jug sitting on a rock in the middle of a creek, an inch above the water line, with some water splashed on surrounding rocks like somebody had just walked down the middle of the creek. The rocks were in a shallow spot, but there were 2 deep pools on either side, so they would have been in the water at least up to their hips to get away down the creek. Creepy because there was no sign of anyone around. The creek had flooded the night before, jug was clean, whole, undented and dry, looked brand new, had not been in the floodwater. There were no tracks on the bank, and it would have been close to impossible for anyone else to have been in that narrow canyon without me being aware of them. I'd have seen their tracks or seen them. No explanation for it other than that somebody had heard me coming, and scampered down the middle of the creek to avoid leaving tracks before climbing out somewhere where the bank was rocky, and hiding. I left that area in a hurry. My partner and I were deep in Mount Adams Wilderness Area, Washington State, US, and there were no other campers around. We had spent the day fishing and exploring the creek around our camp. Around 2 a.m., he wakes me up and tells me to be quiet. Our little dog is quietly growling and looking in one direction. About 15 yards north of the tent, I can hear rustling and a woman's voice speaking quietly to herself, couldn't discern any words. There is no light, just the voice and the walking noise. It goes quiet and then picks back up on the other side of the tent, which is even deeper woods, then it faded off into the dense forest. My partner had literally grabbed his gun and was getting ready to confront them, but since it seemed to move on, nothing ever came of it. I cannot stress enough how deep these woods were. We had explored the day before and I had scratches from twigs and branches, it was so dense. The fact that there was someone alone wandering around talking to themselves in the middle of the night without a light or camp is so freaky, and I still get chills whenever I think about it. The next morning we investigated and didn't find any tracks, but there was a really haphazardly lit fire, charred remains, in the middle of forest/logging road about a mile up. It was still kind of warm. I know there is a small town, about 150 people, about 10 miles south from where we were camped. So maybe it was a drunk teenager? We were almost touching the Yakima Indian Reservation also, and the logging roads were still actively used. But still, so bizarre. This definitely falls into the strangest category. Was solo pitching for a long weekend in the Pacific Northwest, and one day was in the rare part of the trail that is closer to civilization, so there was a higher chance of other hikers/campers being around. I saw one or two people but was mostly from afar, and as it was nightfall soon and getting cold and I was getting deeper into the woods, I knew the odds of seeing someone else was highly unlikely. I was hiking around a small pond and was going to set up camp nearby when I heard some shuffling noises behind a small boulder/rock wall type thing. It was a repetitive noise, and got louder and then quieter, but never stopped at all, and basically if you're a regular hiker you know a noise that does not fit the woods when you hear it. I took out my 2 knives that I carry when hiking, and slowly walked around the boulder, honestly not knowing what I would see. What I did not expect, and was very shocked to see, was a very attractive couple in their 20s having very aggressive but happy doggy-style sex on a blanket. Obviously they were as shocked as I was to see one another, and they freaked out and yelled, as did I, and as they covered their bodies in their clothes in a panic I awkwardly apologized, picked up all my gear and just sort of jogged off into the woods, passing their tent they had pitched along the way, same way I had seen the tent the dude had pitched in his nether regions. Also in another part of the country I thought I saw a bear once and it turned out to be a giant pile of mud. I wonder if that couple is still together, and if tell that story when they get drunk at parties, like I do. I live near Lake of the Woods in northwestern Ontario. This one time a friend and I were mountain biking on a hot August day when we ended up on a trail in the bush where there is an old abandoned car graveyard. Nothing too scary, it's pretty normal for people to scrap their cars in the bush around here, so we carry on. Buddy and I are excited to explore the area because there are a lot of interesting vehicles and parts to build jumps with. We ended up sticking around for about an hour or two until dusk was starting to set in when we came across a black 1950 Buick Roadmaster that looked like it got halfway through restoration. That's when we realized that something was sort of off about this place. There were no properties near this spot for miles, and it was very strange that someone would abandon such a beautiful car halfway through a repair. My alarm bells were ringing, but only a little, so we carried on, as we were pretty beat from all the riding we were doing that day. We decided to find a place to rest and walked a little more into the trail towards a small dirt pile when we immediately realized that something was definitely wrong. The place was littered with animal bones from different animals. There were deer skulls, rabbits, dogs, and what looked like feline bones. I'm starting to feel a little sick to my stomach, but my buddy seems unfazed by it. I can't tell if he's the braver of the two of us or less intelligent at this point because I keep telling him with increasing urgency that we need to get on our bikes and get the hell out of here. He tells me I shouldn't worry and tries to rationalize it by saying that it was some hunter illegally dumping here, despite the canine bones. He walked to the other side of the dirt pile, turned around ghost white and said we need to get the fuck out of here. Now I managed to peek around and caught a glimpse of what was on the other side. Holy Jesus, someone built a shrine here. At this point I'm screaming inside of my head to leave and I scramble to grab my bike and my backpack. As we're about to pedal off we hear someone shouting hey. To the right of us in the thick. I've never bolted so damn fast out of somewhere in my entire life. I tried to get a glimpse behind me. There was an old man in a plaid shirt and blue jean overalls at near the dirt pile with a shovel in his hand shouting at us and gesturing us to come back. When we thought got close enough to the main road, we decided to take a break to catch our breath. My friend and I are soaked with sweat, chugging our water and completely unsure of what we just saw. We sat on the road for about 5 minutes, relieved that nothing became of it, and talked about what it might have been. My friend still trying to rationalize it. Suddenly we can hear a loud vroom. My heart skipped a beat. He started the fucking car. We peeled it down the main road to his house in what felt like 2 minutes for what should have been at least a 10-minute ride. I could feel the lactic acid building up in my legs from pedaling so hard, gears maxed out even going uphill. This was 12 years ago. To this day I still don't know what was happening down that trail, but I'm glad I never stayed to find out. This wasn't really deep woods camping, because my friends and I were staying at a designated campsite in a state park. But it's still a scary story. In the middle of the night, I want to say around 1 a.m., I'm woken up to the sound of gunshots. 2 of the other friends in my tent also woke up. It sounded like the gunshots were getting closer and closer over the course of a half hour. It went from that sounds far away to that sounds like a bullet hit something in camp. Like I said, this was a state park. Hunting is illegal, which either meant some reckless hunter was ignoring the law and hunting after midnight, or some deranged lunatic was just walking around shooting into the woods. Friends and I stayed low to the ground, afraid that a stray bullet would come into our tent. Eventually we began to see spotlights crossing over the roof of our tent as some state troopers in a helicopter began searching the area for the suspect. An hour after we first heard the gunshots, we heard some police sirens on the main road above us. The campsite was located at the bottom of a valley. There were shouts of "Drop the weapon." I said, "Drop the weapon." A few more gunshots, the sounds of some frantic scrambling and shouting instructions, then eventually silence. The next morning, we went to ask the campsite managers if they knew what happened last night. It turns out there was a guy who lived in a house that was higher up the side of the mountain, above the main road. He did some meth that night, and decided that it would be fun to fire his gun at any cars that passed on the main road. The state troopers arrived and arrested him. There were bullet holes in some of the trees around camp, and in one of the RVs that was parked in one of the neighboring campsites. I'm really relieved that no one was hurt or killed by the gunman. Especially after seeing how close those bullets came to going through some of the campers' tents. My dad used to tell me a story from when he was a teenager hunting with my grandpa. They used to live in southern Idaho. One summer they had camped down in a valley and planned to hike up into the hills early the next morning. This was the kind of place where they didn't expect to see another human for miles. Early morning came and they set out into the hills a few hours before sunrise. Neither used a flashlight cause their eyes had adjusted to the moonlight. As they were climbing the hill, my dad turned around to take a look at the valley of brush below them and their campsite in the distance. This is when he noticed several red lights moving quickly across the valley several feet off the ground heading towards their camp. At first, he thought it could be a plane, but there were dozens of them and they were randomly moving like a flock of birds and made no sound. This was back in the 80s, so drones aren't a thing. Dad was about to shout an alarm when my grandpa barked at him to keep moving. Grandpa's not the kind of man you disobey, so Dad kept moving. A few minutes later, Grandpa stops and has the 2 of them crawl into a bush that provided a good covered position to look into the valley. Turns out, Gramps had seen the lights moving about way back when they were still at camp and wanted to get some distance between them. They pulled out some binoculars to try and get a better look but didn't come up with much. They moved faster than birds and seemed to be just glowing balls of red light with no discernible features. Over time it seemed obvious that they had been hanging out in the sky right above their campsite and continued to circle it for quite a while. Dad and Grandpa stayed there watching them, not saying a word. Eventually, the sun began to rise over the horizon. And as it began to touch the valley floor, Dad's ears were blasted by an extremely loud and high-pitched sound that seemed to have come from the flying objects. When the noise eventually stopped, the objects began to rise higher into the air and headed up into the mountains in the opposite direction from their hiding spot. After a while, they returned to camp and found it absolutely trashed. Nothing was stolen and it didn't seem like their food was eaten either, so they don't think it was bandits or animals who did it. All they know is those lights scared the hell out of them and neither went back there again. Back in high school, the only place to be alone was a spot my boyfriend and I scoped out in the middle of the woods. Required driving out to a pretty remote area via long dirt roads many miles from town, opening a very heavy fence/gate, then driving a few miles on a narrow 1-lane dirt road to a dead-end clearing by the lake. Then you could park and neck, as the kids say. Lots of other teens knew about it, but the spot/path could only be used by 1 car at a time. One night, we drove out, opened the fence, and drove to our spot. I remember that there was no moon that night, so the only illumination was our headlights. We park, and start to do our thing, when I started to get a really strange feeling. I told him I was feeling weird and he agreed that it was a little extra creepy without the moon, so we turned the car back on and drove back out the way we came. We did not come across any other cars or see any other vehicles. On the way back, we are driving slowly in silence with just our headlights lighting up the trees, when on the right side of the road, I saw a figure dressed entirely in white. He was just standing there, no flashlight, standing on the side of the road. He could have touched the car as we went by, that's how close to the road I spotted him. Convinced I was just crazy, I said nothing. Then we got back to the fence. It was closed and latched. Someone had closed it behind us. Whoever it was had to be on foot, because there was no car on the one-lane dirt road. On foot in the middle of the woods, with no light. My poor high school boyfriend just about shit himself but bravely got out, flung the fence open, and got back into the car, trembling. When we got back to his parents' house, I finally blurted out that I saw a man on the side of the road. He blanched and said, and he was wearing all white, right? He saw him too. He agreed that if the man had a flashlight or any kind of light source, we would have seen it from a mile away down the straight dirt path. He said that he saw the man watching us in the rearview mirror as we drove away. Just standing and watching. Neither of us could figure out what happened that night. We had been out there a dozen times and nothing like that ever happened. We never went back and we never spoke of it again. In the days before kids, my husband and I used to go wild camping. The first time we went wild camping on Dartmoor, UK National Park, using an old map, we wandered onto a bog in bad weather. It took my husband, the navigator, about 3 hours to find us a way out. Everywhere we stepped out, feet sank into the mud and water visibly pooled on the surface of the sodden ground. We were new to wild camping and didn't have the best gear at the time. A while later we stopped in a forested area and saw police tape everywhere, so we moved on. The next day we stopped off in a small B&B pub for a meal. The bar TV was playing Wimbledon, but during a news break the forested area and boy from the day before were shown. Police had found the body of a guy, 18 or so, I think, who had been camping with friends and wandered alone onto the bog in the dark. Admittedly there was alcohol involved, but I'd been quite anxious wandering around that boggy moor, and had brought home that without my husband I could have quite easily died on the moor. I love wild camping but have zero sense of direction, and it's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it how quickly the weather can change and go from clear to fog so thick you can't see anything. A few winters ago some friends and I went on a road trip in West Virginia. We decided to camp on top of Hawksbill Mountain even though the shelter there is off limits for overnight campers. They even cemented the fireplace to discourage people. The night started off well enough and the stars made for some decent long exposures. Eventually the wind and cold made us all head back to the shelter and get ready to sleep. I don't remember if we were still awake or awoken by the noise. The noise was like nothing I have ever heard before and have a hard time describing since it has been so long. The best comparison I can think of is Native American throat singing or a didgeridoo mixed with some sort of beat like drums. It was very rhythmic and very terrifying. If you've ever been to the top of Hawksbill, you know there is a semi-large cliff directly in front of the shelter and behind is all trees. The noise was coming from over the cliff, seemingly in the valley where no hikers would be, and regardless it was past midnight and pitch black. It's hard to explain, but the noise was terrifying, it was haunting and really chilled your bones. Half the group wanted to leave everything behind and sprint the maybe 1 mile trail back to the car. The other half didn't want to leave, and I think we were all too scared to move. It lasted for hours. I fell asleep after probably 2 to 3 hours of this. Nothing strange happened in the morning, but we were all haunted by it. It is still the scariest thing I have ever experienced camping, and I am extremely suspect of the supernatural, but this changed my mind a bit. Reflecting on it now, it is easy to dismiss the experience, but I remember being truly terrified of whatever was making that noise. I don't think it could have been the wind, as once it started it never stopped, and as I said it was rhythmic like a song, like something playing an instrument from another world. Since then I've gone back to Hawksbill once overnight, but nothing happened. I don't know what really happened that night. I'm curious if some others have camped Hawksbill and experienced a similar event. I was with a couple buddies hiking some trails up by Helen, GA. We decided to follow some game trails off of the main trail just to see what we could come across. Around an hour into the game trail we realized we should turn back, but we had made so many loops and turns that we quickly ended up lost. We started just cutting back in the general direction of the main trail, and we came across a clearing with a very run-down and decaying cabin. Naturally, being young and dumb males, we decided to explore it. The front door was just hanging and fell off when we tried to open it. Parts of the floor would collapse as we walked through. There was an old nasty looking mattress that was covered in mold and mostly decayed. a bunch of dishes laying in random places, and what appeared to be a very old ham radio. In one of the rooms we found a completely decomposed skeleton of what we assume was a dog or coyote. After exploring for a bit, we decided to hit the main trail before dark set in so we could set up camp and not get lost. Have been back about 5 times since then and can never seem to find that cabin again. I was hiking a section of the North Umpqua Trail, northern part of southern Oregon, a few years back with my sil. It's a 72-mile trail broken into sections that can be easily hiked in a day. At the time, I lived about midway up the trail, fairly remote in a small community. It was mid-fall this one day when we set out. The trail was running along the south side of the Umpqua River and was pretty up and down in the beginning. We made it to a fairly flat section that was running just above the river. There was this beautiful view of the river through the trees, so we stopped to get some pictures and take a water break. I immediately felt extremely uncomfortable. Like someone was watching us. I slowly turned my head to look behind us, across the trail and up a very small incline. Through the trees I could see a small meadow. Across the meadow, maybe 15 yards from us, was a tent. An old, canvas-style tent. As I'm looking, I notice bones strung from the trees all around the meadow. Like creepy death wind chimes. My stomach just clenched and dropped. I leaned into Sil and whispered, "Do not turn around and look behind us. Just continue walking up the trail and run when I tell you." We were close enough to the river that nobody not right next to us could have heard this. She did exactly as I told her to, setting off at the brisk walk we'd been at before. We got maybe 10 yards, and I could hear footsteps through the forest floor, coming from behind and slightly above us. That part of the forest is very dense, there is a thick moss cover under the trees, so footsteps on it make a very specific sound. I leaned forward and told her to pick up her speed. She did, I did, and so did whoever was behind us. I leaned forward again and told her to run as fast as she could and not stop until I told her to. For 2 middle-aged women, both slightly overweight, we ran like the damn wind. I just kept telling her, "Go, go, go." I could see ahead of us that the trail made an incline and veered to the right along the river and around a cliff. I knew at that point that whoever it was going to have to come down onto the trail or stop. We kept running. We probably ran at least a mile after that, even though we could no longer hear anyone behind or above us. That section of the trail was about 9 miles and we were not halfway when this happened. We eventually slowed down, but just hurried as fast as we could the rest of the way. We had arranged for her younger brother, not my ex, to pick us up. We made it to the next trailhead fairly early, so we made our way out to 138 and started walking east towards home, knowing he'd find us. He did, and was shocked at our story. We got home and immediately called our local sheriff, who lived just above us at the ranger station. He came to the house and heard our story. He explained it might be a day or two before they could get in on the trail, as they had a missing hunter at the time they were searching for. So a few days go by and he shows up at our house to let me know that we were not crazy or imagining things and someone really did chase us. I asked what they found and who it was. He looked down at the ground and then looked up and said, "I'm not going to tell you what we found or who it was, because if I do, you will never hike anywhere again. What we found was not normal and will not happen up here again." He then instructed me to never, ever hike unarmed again. I never found out what they found or who it was. I never hiked that section of trail again, and it completely burnt last year. I also never hiked unarmed, ever again. That was huge for me, as I was not a gun person. I had many incidents living up there in a national forest with wild animals and other strange things, but nothing ever scared me as much as that day. I was out solo hiking in Italy in 2016. It was memorable for 2 reasons. The first instance was a strange one. I was on a trail to Monteferrato, a natural stone arch that overlooks coastline, giving stunning views of the sea and northern part of the Apuan Alps through it. Anyway, halfway up the trail I meet cross-couple descending, I presume to be husband and wife. They were maybe in their 50s. As we get closer to each other, I can the male of the couple looking at me in an upset/flustered manner. I don't think too much of it at first, but as our paths cross, this guy stops in front of me and puts his right hand on my shoulder. I could see he was physically shaking, pale, he looked really upset. I did not take his approach to be a threat to me in any way. I was just a little bewildered. I know minimal Italian that would be appropriate for this situation, so I just blurted out, "You okay, mate?" He did mumble something in Italian. But what I do not know. His wife then put her arms around him and said in broken English something to the effect of, "It's okay, you look like someone he once knew." And with that she pulled her husband away and they went down the mountainside. It was like the guy had just seen a ghost. Obviously I have no idea who I reminded him of. I just hope it was not too upsetting for them. The second instance, I think I got an idea of how legends fawns half man half goat came about. This time I was lost, well I was no longer on a designated trail. But knew from my map that if follow this stream downhill I'd cross a road a few miles down and then I'd be back on track. Well almost, this stream turned into a steep rock ravine which then sunk into a sinkhole. Which was a bit too big to get round, so back up I went to some high ground to find a better route down. It was doing this I came to a top of a small ridge with a derelict shepherd's hut. The roof of red pan tiles had long collapsed, but the walls were still standing, with a single broken window doorway. Broke still needing to work out a better route to get down, I threw my backpack on the ground, pulled out my map and against the wall of the hut. 10 minutes must have passed when suddenly I heard something walking over the broken roof tiles inside the hut. Startled I jumped up and stood away from the building. I heard the breaking of tiles underfoot again, but there was a lightness to the sound that told me it possibly was not human feet making this sound. With this thought I gingerly approached the broken window to peer through. To my surprise it was a fucking mountain goat. I let out laugh and with that the goat scarpered out the back of the hut. Intrigued, I went to the back to see where it headed. This goat was super fast. When I got round the back there was this super steep V-shaped valley. It was gone. Or so I thought. On the other side of the incline I saw what I first thought was a very muscular man with horns sprinting up the side of the valley. It took my brain more than a moment to work out that the steep incline gave the perspective of the goat running upright in bipedal fashion. If I didn't have the privilege of seeing this mountain goat moments before in the hut, I would have been convinced I just saw some goat man from ancient legend running up the incline. Mountain biking, so not sure if this counts, but here goes. Was mountain biking deep in the desert in New Mexico. Terrain was high desert mountain foothills. Think juniper, sand, rocks, grasses, cacti, and lots of hills. Noticed something shiny and flashing periodically, glinting in the sun at the top of a hill. Decided to stash my bike to the side of the trail and hike up this hill to check it out. When I get to the top, I find a shiny, mylar-looking weather balloon thing slung over a juniper branch and dangling about a foot above the ground. A massive rattlesnake is laying below the mylar balloon, hissing and lunging and biting at it periodically, causing it to swing around. The thrashing swinging motion of the mylar was catching the sun and was causing the glinting that I originally saw. I nope the fuck out of there and start traversing back down the hill. On my way down, I notice what looks like a gray gravel platform built into the side of the hill just a few hundred meters across from where I was coming down. I traverse over to check it out. Mind you, there are no roads, trails, steps or other indications that any human or machine has access to this man-made looking platform. As I approach this pile of gravel with a flat top built into the side of this hill, I see a sign with more warnings on it than I have ever seen on one sign before. I'm going off of memory here, but the warning sign included poisonous gases, nuclear hazard, trespassing, toxic substances, landslides, pooling water, and open shaft. Being a dumb teenager, this was like 15 years ago, I'm intrigued and decide to check it out. I scramble up to the flat top portion of the platform and I see an open hole in the ground leading straight down further than the eye can see. This opening is squarish, about 5 feet wide, 5 feet long, with rounded corners and seemingly infinitely deep. Being the aspiring explorer/scientist I was as a 15/16 yo, I decided the best way to see how deep it was would be to pick up a large rock and chuck it into the hole. So, I pick up a rock and drop it in. Nothing. Probably not that deep, and the rock just landed in some soft sand a few feet down without making a noise. To be sure, I grab another large rock and this time, instead of dropping it in, I chuck it straight down as hard as I can. Wait a few more seconds, I finally hear a very satisfying thud. Okay, it's really deep. I'm getting out of here. Then, as I start walking down, I hear a second massive thunk. Oh shit, that first thud was the first rock, and I'm only now hearing that second one. This thing must be crazy deep. Like a mile deep or something. I sprint down to my bike, jump on it, and bike away as quickly as I can. Funny thing is I went out there a year or so later, and could never find that shaft again. I think it must have been really well concealed from the trail BC I was looking for it and basically knew where to look, and still never found it.